Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be taking a look at the today's newspaper, that is for 28th August 2023, and we shall be taking a look at the Delhi edition of the today's newspaper and analyzing few of the important articles which have been in relevance, try to understand what kind of questions can be framed from those particular articles and what is it that we can extract in gist rather than going through those elongated articles themselves. So without further ado, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. So first of all, we are going to discuss Himalayan blunders that are ravaging the Himalayas, which has appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper, that is in page 6. So this will be relevant both for your GS paper 1 as well as GS paper 3. So questions are oftentimes asked from this particular topic in either of these papers. Then India's Rohingya refugee children are not criminals. This is about the handling of the refugee crisis and also the handling of the refugees that we have in our country. What are the problems that they face and what can be the relevant way forward? With this article, we shall also try to expand our understanding about the 1951 Convention on Refugees. We are going to try to understand what that convention talks about and whether or not India is a party to that convention. Then the importance of states in space missions. This is relevant for your portion of science and tech. Now, ever since the successful landing of the Chandrayaan 3 mission, space tech has oftentimes been in discussion. So here, it talks about the role of the state or the nation state in particular in order to facilitate excellence in terms of the space programs. And also, what can be done going ahead in order to further stimulate that particular process of state exploration, or rather the state's help in space exploration. And also one has to understand the debate between development and the space expenditure, that ever-growing development debate that is increasing. We are going to spend some time on that as well. Then certain topics only for the relevance of prelims. So Neeraj Chopra crowned as world champion, and that was yesterday, where he actually won a gold medal in terms of the javelin throw. As Pragyaan digs deeper into the moon, VSSC lab looks to the sun, and it is the Aditya L1 mission which is going to be launched. Then somatic mutations of the cell, that has appeared in the science section. So very briefly, we are going to cover that as well. So here, let us take a look at the first topic, and that is Himalayan blunders that are ravaging the Himalayas. This has appeared in page 6 of the newspaper and the editorial section. Now, what is this article about? So this article significantly harps down or concentrates upon the destruction, the devastation which we are witnessing in the Himalayan region, be it in the region of Uttarakhand, be it in the region of Himachal, and earlier also we have had experiences of landslides, slips, avalanches and other forms of disasters across the region of the Himalayan states. So this article discusses about it, that why does it happen? Now, recently in the region of Himachal Pradesh and now lately in the region of Uttarakhand, we have been witnessing scores of properties, scores of public infrastructure getting damaged and ravaged by the process or the wrath of the nature itself. So, why does that happen? And here we have to analyze that all these disasters, yes, there are certain natural causes behind it as well, such as climate change. Climate change is one of the relevant causes behind it, but what are the other anthropogenic causes? Now, before we move on to the anthropogenic aspects, when we talk about the impact of climate change, you have to understand that climate change has induced or has brought about, sporadic, concentrated spells of rain. Means what? Means that the distribution of rainfall which used to exist in the region earlier, that has been distorted. When we talk about the overall rainfall received in the region, the overall rainfall taken on an average across the year, there is not much of a variation indicated in that. But that rainfall, rather than being distributed evenly, let's suppose every 2 days you receive 2 centimeter or 1 centimeter of rainfall. Now, if that regular rainfall is received, the system, the surface, the planet in itself also has got the capacity to absorb that much amount of water. That water slowly will drain itself into the rivers also. Thereby the rivers can also accommodate slight increase in water. But what is happening is you have an excessive period of dry condition followed by a sudden increased burst of rainfall. And that increased burst of rainfall is aided by the dry condition prevailing earlier, and both of these lead to slips and slides. How? So think about it. When you have an extraordinary period of dry condition which is prevalent, now at that point of time the soil of that region, it significantly compacts, it hardens, and it loses its contact with the lower layers of the rocks, and it becomes disjointed solid portion kept on top of this slope. So think about it. If let's suppose here you have the mountain slope, let's assume that you have this layer on top of it, that is the soil which has developed. On top of the soil, let's suppose you have the various different sporadic distribution of vegetation. You don't have a kind of a well-distributed vegetation spread because deforestation is also prevalent. Now during dry conditions, when the conditions are dry for an extraordinary longer period of time, there are significant compactions in the above soil layer. If I represent the top layer as the soil one, this is the rock. So these soils, they get compacted and disjointed because of very dry conditions, and they themselves will develop certain cracks thereby. You would have observed generally when at the peak of the summer, when you take a look at the soil develops many different types of cracks because of being extremely dried up. Something similar happens here as well. Now, if it is followed by an excessive amount of rainfall, the disaster which is caused, the excessive amount of rainfall, let's suppose it occurs in this area. Now all this water mingles very freely with the fragmented portion, and the fragmented portion is simply drained off. It is carried away, it is drained away. And here understand that once this particular portion, which is the toe of the mountain, what is also referred to as the toe of the mountain. Now toe of the mountain holds significant amount of load of the slope above it. So if this toe portion of the mountain, if let's suppose this in itself slips, what will happen is that the above layers, they themselves get disturbed. There is almost as if the support structure which was holding the above layers, that support structure has vanished. So the above layers will come tumbling down. So this is why when you have dry conditions followed by excessive rainfall, it automatically will create such conditions. And where is it that these conditions are damaging us? So basically all that excessive soil, huge amount of debris along with that, now it goes into the nearby river channel. You can observe here, all this eventually debris, the muck, mud, everything will drain into the river channel. Now it deposits itself into the river channel. Thereby, it reduces the volume available for the water to flow. Mind you, excessive rainfall has not only occurred over the land areas, it has occurred over the river region as well. So here also, naturally, you have larger amount of water which needs to be accommodated. But all that debris and muck is getting deposited here. So where will the water go? It will start flooding. So it causes these disasters where the buildings and the landslides are very, very common. The buildings standing on them, the structures which are present, they also experience a slippage. But simultaneously what you also observe is the rampant flooding, and that flooding, when it reaches the foothills of these mountains, it will further oversaturate the toe of the mountain with water, further bringing down everything which was held up together. So this is a part played by climate change in certain aspects. So naturally, this is not something that was observable for hundreds and thousands of years. Because earlier also you had certain instances of this sudden increased burst of rainfall, but immense amount of vegetation in that area that would solve as or actually that would serve as a kind of a buffer, that would create a kind of a conservation mechanism. Because when you have immense amount of vegetation, let's suppose high amount of vegetation, high concentration of vegetation, the roots will bind the soil in its place. So the soil will not naturally get fragmented. So that fragmentation of soil, if you can stop, then automatically all these problems will be solved. But then, due to certain projects such as the various different hydroelectric power projects which are being constructed, certain mining activities which are initiated in certain areas, and a large-scale infrastructural developmental project which is being carried out, that vitiates the slope property. This article basically concentrates upon the Char Dham highway connectivity project. Now the Char Dham, what are those Char Dhams? The Char Dhams in Uttarakhand, basically they are the regions of Yamunotri, Gangotri, Kedarnath and Badrinath. Now these are the areas which are very difficult to reach, and these are the regions which are frequently met with accidents in terms of the traveling pilgrims who do travel there in lakhs and thousands of numbers every year. Now many of them, due to poor conditions of the road, they end up losing their lives because of frequently occurring accidents in this zone. So that is why there is always a predicament whether to improve the infrastructure or take care of the environment. What this article highlights and tells us is that this Char Dham highway project which is being implemented, which is being constructed, in many of the areas it has not carried out its due diligence in terms of the environmental impact assessment. And a failure to carry out that due diligence has meant that unsustainable construction activities have been promoted, which has caused their own set of problems. So here what happens is, during these construction activities, if you will observe, if let's suppose this is the slope, if you want to construct, let's suppose a broad four-way or a four-lane highway there, now you cannot simply construct it on the sloping portion of the slope itself. What you need to do is, you need to dig the slope, you need to alter the slope characteristics. Now what does this do? Here you have done this to construct the highway in this region, to allow the passage of the highway in this region. But what does this actually do is, it makes this slope unstable. Okay? The slope becomes unstable. And mind you, particularly in the region of Shivaliks, mostly you have the presence of the sedimentary system of rocks. Now these sedimentary system of rocks, they keep on absorbing that water, and slowly and steadily the water starts to percolate through them, weakening the entire structural integrity. So that further exaggerates the rate of slip which happens across this slope. Now if let's suppose to add on to that, due to stress of tourism, increased amount of tourism, now the government is trying to basically encourage more tourists to visit these areas in order to give a boost to the revenue and income for the people in that region. Now obviously, in order to cater to the ever burgeoning amount of tourists, there is significant amount of construction which is carried out across these slopes, a sight which is a very common factor in majority of these hill stations. Now all of this will further add on to the weight, and here observe that the slope has a kind of a vacancy beyond it. So that weight induces that slippage, and that means all these buildings come crashing down. So this is an eventuality that is going to brace us in almost all the various different hill stations which are sensitive in terms of their slope topography. Be it Shimla that we see today, it can be Mussoorie, it can be Dalhousie, all these areas which you go for, even take the case of Joshimath event that happened. Now Joshimath in itself, it has got different slope topography because of the region where you find Joshimath to be present in, but there also infrastructural construction, the stoppage of the flow of the rivers, thereby inundating the soil underneath and oversaturating the soil underneath with excessive amount of water, that weakens the soil. Understand one thing in basic commonality. Wherever you have the soil oversaturated with water, soil will flow. You cannot expect the soil to remain in the same place. Soil will flow. And if you have constructed something on top of that soil, it will flow along with that. All that debris you lead and you dump it into the river, it will lead to frequent floodings as well, especially in the lower reaches as we are experiencing. And furthermore, that debris also ends up impacting the very critical aquatic ecosystem and aquatic organisms present. So excessive siltation in the river channels, which happen. Now what does it lead to? So basically that excessive water will start further saturating the toe of the mountain, toe of the hill, and the toe of the hill further becomes unsustainable, and that induces further slippage. Deforestation, which is happening at a rampant scale in order to give rise to the infrastructure, in order to allow for tourism, and also in order to allow for illegal constructions happening in various places, along with generally deforestation carried out for the poaching and the smuggling of the woods. So all these purposes weakens the soil structure, and these are seismically fragile areas. So these are the areas which are frequented with earthquakes, and whenever these earthquakes they do happen, every time that rock to soil relationship that is weakened or is in a way reset every time. So it is highly unstable. So what is it that we should do going ahead? So proper environmental impact assessment should be carried out when it comes to constructing anything in the sloping areas, when it comes to having any kind of construction which involves breaking of the slope or manipulating the slope. Regardless of the length of the infrastructure being constructed, you need to carry out in environmental impact assessment. Everything comes to or should be into that category. And here, few of the projects, they have basically been given exemption because of the strategic requirements, because all the hilly areas, all these mountainous areas, they form our long contiguous border with a hostile neighbor, that is China, in the case of the northern border. Now, there for strategic purposes, fair enough. You can in a way skip this process of a prolonged EIA clearance which is required for construction. You can skip it up, but still you can get the clearance, but still even after those projects are completed, a periodic EIA needs to be carried out in order to ensure that the infrastructure for which we have put all the money, all the men and the material into, whether that infrastructure is resilient, or whether in tomorrow's rain or day after tomorrow's rain everything will be drained away and again we are left to construct it from the scratch. So for conservation of resources, for critical utilization of resources, EIA is a must. Zonal master plan needs to be developed for urban regions and settlements. Okay? For the urban regions and settlements, this zonal master plan, it needs to develop so as to have a proper mechanism where construction should be allowed, where it should not be allowed, and it should be executed very stringently, where all the illegal construction activities need to be demolished as soon as possible. Analysis of the river channels and their health needs to be taken into consideration, whether the river topography in itself is being modified in the long run. If the river is forced to take a newer path due to excessive amount of deposition or sedimentation, means havoc will be caused somewhere else, or for a longer run the mountain will keep on becoming unstable. And the waste, that is the construction debris, and oftentimes in the urban settlements in these hilly areas, even the municipal solid waste which is readily dumped, that also in a way changes the river morphology, which can impact the stability of the soil. Okay, so in this article we have studied basically that what are the Himalayan blunders which we are actually going through, which we are committing, which is incurring the wrath of the nature upon us. And here we have also talked about the role of climate change, but that is very brief. It is majorly the anthropogenic activities which are causing considerable amount of damage, and what should be done going ahead into the future. Now we move on to the second article, and that is India's Rohingya refugee children are not criminals. This has also appeared in page 2 or page 6 rather. That is the portion of editorial itself. Now here it talks about that how do we in India we treat the refugees. Now August 2023 actually marks 6 years since the onset of the Rohingya crisis. So Rohingyas are the ethnicities of the region of Myanmar. Now they're facing significant amount of suppression, significant amount of social ostracization, and also to some extent the fear of ethnic cleansing that they faced. Many of these Rohingyas, they migrated out of Myanmar and they migrated to different regions of the world. Obviously, many of them migrated in various countries of South Asia. Overall, it caused more than 7,70,000 Rohingyas to flee from their homeland. Around 20,000 are presently estimated to be present in India, even though unofficial figures sometimes peg this number to be slightly higher. Now in India, many of them, they settle in various different, and they are forced to settle down by the authorities in various different constricted areas. Many of the times, it appears to look very similar to the kind of detention facilities out there, with not perfect kind of sanitation facility, not perfect conditions being provided to them. So there arises the problem of human rights and child rights. That is what the article talks about. It talks about the importance of respecting the human rights even in the case of refugees, because the refugees, they are not here by a kind of a choice in their life. They are here because they have been forced to move out of their home. So here, India, even though it is not a party of the Convention of 1951, which is also referred to as the Geneva Convention of 1951 for refugees. Now, India is not a signatory to that, but still, India does house and does have a host of various different refugees of different ethnicities who have been living in the country for a longer period of time. Now, this entire debate was instigated by a recent event which unfolded in the region of Jammu Kashmir, where you had an unfortunate death of a young Rohingya child. Now, obviously, the conditions are not very good for the refugees. Refugees, first of all, you have to understand that they don't get adequate conditions in terms of facilities of water supply, of sanitation, and other facilities. They are particularly less. So in these conditions, when they are forced to live, thereby there is a greater onset of diseases, and also many of them, due to these lackings and due to these sufferings, many of them, they are unable to contribute economically to their family's well-being. And that creates a law and order problem and a law and order situation in certain areas as well, where people, due to lack of economic opportunities, many of them, they pick the easy side of illegal activities, and that is where the law and order problem is also created. So, first of all, let us understand what is this 1951 Convention on Refugees, for which India is not a signatory of, and why is it that India is not a signatory of it. We will discuss that as well. But before that, what is a refugee? Who do we consider as a refugee? So, if you take a look at the definition, so a refugee, here first of all, let us take a look at the definition, then we will analyze what is the meaning. So, someone who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or a political opinion, is outside the country of their nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail of the protection of that country. Means because of any of the factors such as what is the race that which the people belong from, what is the religion that they belong from, whether they have a different political mooring of their own, or whether they have a different ethnicity. Because of that, they are forced to move out of the country, or in a way, they are not felt a part of that country, and they are not particularly encouraged to seek the protection of the law enforcement of the country, because they feel there is a significant degree of biasness, who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of their former habitual residence, is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to return to it. Where due to such very realistic fears, you don't want to go into that country. You don't want to live there because you are not sure of your own survivability. That is the definition of refugees. Now, oftentimes people confuse them with the migrant population. Now, migrants are someone, or they are different in the category, because they choose to move out from one place, they choose to move into some other place owing to the push and the pull factors. There is always a certain set of push factors which induces the migrants to move from one region. Because when they choose to move out of a region, generally it is because of lack of economic opportunities, maybe social, cultural discrimination in certain cases, such as caste or religious discrimination which happens, or maybe due to certain geographical factors out there as well. So this is driven purely by push and pull factors. So if I decide, let's suppose, today to move from any of the state to, let's say, Mumbai or Delhi, now that is where I won't be considered as any other classification, but we will be migrants because we are moving for certain set of different reasons. So these are dominated by push and pull factors. Okay. The push factors are basically relevant for the place of origin, where they are moving from or they want to move out from, and this is for place of destination. Okay, where they are in a way planning to go. Now, here the foundation of this convention is based on the principle of non-refoulement. What is this principle of non-refoulement, if you consider this? So basically, it talks about the very basic principle that if an individual is forced to move out from a region, if a refugee, let's suppose, that refugee has been forced to move out from the region of Tibet, let's suppose. Now, that person has moved out or is pushed out owing to the conditions in Tibet, because that person no longer feels safe there. Or let's consider the case of Rohingyas themselves. They have moved out of, or they have been pushed out of Myanmar because there was significant amount of sufferings which were being handed out to them, many of the times from the side of the authorities as well. They were not given proper protection in many of the cases, and many of the cases they were singled out and mercilessly they were killed. Right? Now these people, if let's suppose they have come to Bangladesh or India to seek shelter, to seek some kind of protection. Now, if let's suppose India forces them back into Myanmar, obviously that is like signing a death warrant for them. That is something which they would never want. So the principle of non-refoulement talks about the fact that a refugee who has come to your place, you shall not force them back into the place of origin where they are coming from, in order to seek a greater protection. So that is the principle of non-refoulement, not forcing the refugees back to the country where they came from. Okay? Now this convention provides certain rights to the refugees. Now this is relevant for you because this particular portion about handling of the refugee crisis has earlier been asked in the case of the essay paper as well and in the mains paper as well. So you should be aware about the rights granted to the refugees under the Geneva Convention of 1951. So the right not to be expelled except under certain strictly defined conditions where they have woefully, in a way, crossed the limit for maintaining public order and law and order. In those cases, you can expel them, but otherwise, you should not. Right not to be punished for illegal entry into the territory of a contracting state. The rights to work, housing, education, public relief and assistance, freedom of religion, access to courts, and freedom of movement within the territory. This is where, due to lack of proper policy structure, in India we don't have a proper policy structure so as to how to handle these refugees. That is where ill treatment does happen or is meted out in various different areas. So that is why freedom of movement within the territory, right to work, housing, that is essential. If this does not occur or if this is not given to them, then the set of problems that we have discussed, owing to poor sanitation and poor conditions, there is a health issue or a health hazard problem which can get created. Owing to the lack of opportunities that they are provided, oftentimes they are left at the mercy of authorities to give them a grain of food. Then owing to the various different lack of functionality or movement, they are not allowed to move freely within the country itself because they don't have proper documentation, and they are not encouraged also to have proper documentation there. So as a result of that, they are confined to a particular area, and many of them are forced into illegal activities as well. Now, rights to be issued identity and travel document, which is not done. Right to be protected from refoulement apply to all refugees, all the various refugees that you have, all of them should be driven by the principle of non-refoulement. Okay. Now in India, we have a variety and different ethnicities of refugee population which live here. So basically, this is relevant for your prelims. Okay. So you have the Tibetans, Buddhist Chakmas from the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, Sri Lankan Tamils, Rohingyas from Myanmar, Bhutanese from the region of Nepal, populations from Somalia, Sudan and other sub-Saharan African nations also. You find the refugee population to be coming into India, living into India. But why is it that India is not a signatory to the convention? If this convention is so very important to maintain the level of sanity and the proper conditions of living for the refugees, why is it that India is not a signatory? That is because of certain basic principles. You have to understand the backdrop in which the country was in a way given independence, and immediately after independence, India had to suffer significant amount of issue due to the partition. Now, at the time when the partition happened, for a longer period or for some amount of time, we did allow the movement of people across the border. And for that, because it was being carried out naturally, India did not feel an urge to sign upon this. Initially, this convention was restricted majorly to the areas which were impacted after World War I and after World War II. So that was the backdrop or the background under which this convention was drafted. India felt that we have always been a melting pot of civilization and melting pot of cultures out there. So naturally people do come in, people do move out. What is the need for signing on this convention? Because anyways we handle so many refugees. Then in 1971 came the Bangladesh crisis, where you had millions and millions of refugees driving or moving into the Indian territory. Now, at that point of time, India provided proper shelter, proper care and proper hospitality to them. India was not driven by the principles of the convention, but it was driven by the values which define us as a nation. So there also, the necessity for signing the convention did not drive our action forward. It was our actions which were always collinear with the aspects or the various different provisions under the convention. By the way, this convention has got a 1967 protocol. A 1967 protocol has been provided here. And this protocol, in a way, it removes all the geographical and the time-based barriers that the convention had. Because as I told you, initially the convention was designed to deal with the refugees created out of the impact of World War I and World War II. But then the refugees were also present during the Korean War. Refugees were also present during the Vietnam War. Refugees have always been prevalent in many parts of the world. So that is why the 1967 protocol made the convention time and geography independent. That anywhere or everywhere where the refugees they are moving, either due to the social strife, the civil war which is created, external aggression, anything, political authoritarianism which is created, so anything, they come under the category of refugees. So after that the Bangladesh crisis came, India handled it. But after and during the late 70s and 80s, the conditions significantly changed due to the impact on security, where you had the experience, in our case we had the experience where many people posing as refugees would come and create various different nuances inside the territory of the country. So security condition has been very prevalent, and security considerations rather, they have driven our policy for not signing this convention. We are not bound by this convention, but we shall be driven by our humanistic ethos out there. So what is the way forward? What is the solution? And that is very important. What is the way forward here? Way forward, you can think about it. First of all, security, anxieties and insecurities need to be addressed first. So first of all, proper documentation needs to be done. A separate documentation needs to be provided identifying the people as refugees in certain cases, where they need to be provided protection, not for a kind of a vicious propaganda which is carried out many of the times against them, but in order to provide them certain protection. So documentation to the highest standards and improved monitoring, so that you are aware whether there is any kind of nuisance created or not. Secondly, opportunity to collaborate with the local community for meaningful employment. Then after that, also we can talk about facilitating ease of movement from one region to another. Ease of movement, so that only one particular area doesn't face excessive amount of burden. Then also we have another aspect which can be done, improvement in availability of basic necessities of life. What is considered to be a meaningful and respectable life, where you have access to food, you have access to drinking water, you have access to sanitation, these basic, and also in certain cases access to shelter and housing as well. So that should be ensured at the level of the government. Then devising a policy for handling refugees. Now this ideally has to be done at the central level, but even the state governments, when the refugees, they do come into the various different states, the states oftentimes, they are left clueless so as to how to handle them, where to house them. So oftentimes they are housed, as we have seen in the example of this Jammu and Kashmir event, or incident rather, there all the refugees were housed in a large, which earlier used to serve as a prison building. So in that particular infrastructural setup, there the refugees were housed. So oftentimes they are not aware of what to do. They are not having a kind of a timeline so as to tell when they will have to spend some resources. So there the state government also needs to work upon, particularly the border states. They need to be able to devise the handling of refugees and the policy for that. So that can provide a better human right, child right record when it comes to India. And we are a country who believes not in the regulations which are demonstrated or dictated to us by any convention, but by the basic ethos of humanity. Moving on to the next article, that is the importance of state in space missions. Now here, when we talk about the space, this has appeared, by the way, in page 7. So when we talk about the importance of states here, states, by that we refer to the nation state. So what is the role played by the nations in facilitating the various different space missions? When we talk about the space missions, that has been prevalent across the planet and has been launched primarily from the region of United States and the erstwhile Soviet Union through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It was during the 90s when other countries started catching up to the space race. When we talk about lunar landing, because that is very much in focus, we are, by now, all of us are well aware that there have been only 4 countries which have attempted the lunar landing, including United States, Soviet Union, then the People's Republic of China, and the 4th country being India. Now, out of these countries, only United States can be categorized as a developed country. The rest 3 fall into the category of developing nations. Now, there is an argument that why these nations which are under the category of the developing nations, why are they able to achieve success in these space missions? There is always that ever prevailing inquisitiveness amongst the minds of various social scientists as well, that how come these countries are able to achieve this. So one part which the article talks about is the role of population. The role played by population when you consider the region of Soviet Union, when you consider China, when you consider India, population is significantly larger as compared to US. Now that increased size of population, here when we have population, a larger amount of population in these developing nations, then what happens? Greater human resources, right? Human resources are the most important factor here. Greater availability of human resources out there. So when you have greater availability of human resources, there is always going to be a chance to excel. But here, this rule of population is defied when you consider the success paved by Qatar Space Agency, which has been established very recently. But with the help of Japanese space missions, they have managed to launch a module into space and into the injection in the Martian orbit, something that very few countries before that had achieved. So there, you don't have the role played by population. So if we have to further consider that what are the factors at play which make space exploration a success, and where does the role of state fit in? So here, the role of the state is very important in skilling of the labor force, regardless of the size of the population. If you don't provide the adequate and relevant skill, till that point of time, you cannot in a way instigate research. And when we say skilling, it should be general skilling, general understanding of the STEM subjects, that is science, tech, engineering, mathematics. That skilling should be provided at a basic curriculum level. In our country, in many of the areas, we are doing that. But when it comes to the higher education, the higher secondary education, there we are still lagging behind with the likes of China, etc. when it comes to the quality of skill that we are providing to the labor force. For example, this article also does point you out that when it comes to countries such as China, For the past few years, it has been observed they are always in the race for filing the maximum number of research patents in the world, which tells you that the research ecosystem infrastructure which is being built up, that is world class, and that is going to bring China to the level of world dominance in the coming years as well. If you take the related areas of, let's suppose, quantum tech, space tech, in certain areas, you'll find that China's progress, if not at par, in many areas it is even higher than what has been achieved by United States. So that skilling of labor force is very, very essential. And here, you don't have to forcefully drive down only one path of development. You have to inspire innovation, be it in any area. And that innovation has brought a kind of an economically cheaper missions being launched by countries like India as well. So that portion of inspiring innovations, that has to be considered. Enabling ecosystem for private companies to participate. Without the participation of private companies, for a resource-starved nation such as India, it is very difficult to match the level of space exploration initiated or indicated by the European Space Agency, by United States, and even nowadays by China, because we have the paucity of resource, we have the scarcity of resource. So how do we fulfill that? For example, take a look at the rockets that we use in order to launch the missions. The Aditya L1 mission, which we are going to put further between Earth and the Sun, which is going to be one of the farthest missions, amongst the farthest missions that India has launched, we are using a larger PSLV rocket in itself, the expandable form. Even for the Chandrayaan mission, we did make use of the GSLV or LMV in itself. Now, we don't have very powerful rockets, we don't have many critical technologies which are required for these launches, and that will come with a sustained private participation. We can see the benefit of it, what SpaceX is doing to United States space program. That SpaceX is a private organization, so it has got ample amount of scope to carry out research in any of the areas. When you talk about the government funded organizations, their domain many of the times is restricted to the immediate goals, and they keep on fulfilling those immediate goals, oftentimes unable to draw a larger horizon, a larger aim for themselves. So that is why private participation is required. And here we also need an institute to industry connect. So that what the industry requires, the institutes, they teach that. Currently, there is a broad disconnect. What is being taught in the engineering colleges, in the science institutes in our country, is a technology of the 60s, 70s and the 80s, which is not relevant in the modern scenario. And that is why the people graduating out of them, they are oftentimes thought to be misfits in the industry. So that is why you need a broader institute where industry can, let's suppose with the help of the government, devise certain special scholarships for certain unique niche areas such as AI, usage of robotics in terms of space tech or space exploration, certain critical technologies of space exploration as well, such as nozzle tech, etc. So that is where the Institute Industry Connect can come in handy. Hand holding in critical technologies, certain critical technologies which have been developed by ISRO over a long period of time, and also various components and subdivisions of ISRO, that should be shared with the nascent private sector in order to have a kind of a boost in development. And we need to have a larger goal setting. We cannot go one project after another project after another project. Institutes and various different organizations such as ISRO, they can never be bothered or bogged down only based upon satellite launches. That we have launched 20 satellites again, we have launched 5 satellites again. PSLV has been doing that endlessly. ISRO needs to set itself apart from this entire milieu of space launches by setting a larger goal of what is its goal of exploring, let's suppose, the human flight in space. Is it restricted only to putting a human in space? Are we interested in putting human on the Mars as well? If yes, what is the timeline? What are the technologies that we need to develop? So there needs to be a shorter and a larger goal setting as well. But this also does bring us to the debate between the space exploration and development. This is a debate which has been in prevalence since the 1960s itself. At the time when, and this article indicates about it, at the time when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, simultaneously there was a debate which was prevalent that a country such as United States, which is facing so many issues, racial discrimination, etc., why is it focusing on moon? Why isn't it focusing on the planet Earth as well? This time also, while the Chandrayaan-3 mission has been a success, you have had the various voices from within the country and also obviously from the western part of the world as well, where they talk about that a country which is poor, a country which is still having so many people below the poverty line, such as India, where many people don't have the basic necessities which are fulfilled, how is it that India can think about space exploration in this condition? So that is where you have to understand that space exploration is not only about having your name out there, that we are the fourth country, we are the first country in the south pole of the moon. It is not restricted to that. The technology that you develop for space tech or the space exploration, that technology comes in significant amount of use in many of the civilian aspects of life. For example, if you talk about the development of cleaner fuel, that is the hydrogen based fuel. Now that was first of all explored in the space tech, in the launching of the various rockets where you have the cryogenic fuel, the mixing of hydrogen and oxygen which is done to produce the thrust to the rockets in the liquid propulsion. So that is again developed out of space tech. Now that can pave way for clean energy, isn't it? Then in the area of robotics, we have better command and control so that we get an idea about how to control or how to carry out some unmanned missions even in unexplored areas of the planet. For example, we have still not managed to explore the depths of the ocean. So there these robotics will come into play. Then development of material tech. That is also of significant role and significant usage, because the materials that you use, that can help you devise the better form of conductors, semiconductors, etc. That will also help in various different electronic industry and electrical industry and so on. Then after that, you have a direct economic use in the sense of an institute or an organization like ISRO has specialized in launching these various space programs at very cheap cost. And that has attracted a lot of various consumers from across the globe who are piggybacking on our PSLV to launch their satellite and place them in the orbit. So that brings a very vital foreign exchange reserve. So think about it, an organization which is only carrying out space launches or satellite launches, compare that to an organization which has the ability to reach the moon, which has the ability to reach the Mars, which has the ability to explore beyond. Obviously the credibility will be much larger in the latter case. So the space exploration adds credibility to the organization, which will further be capitalized in the form of the economic benefit. But barring all of this, the most important, it instigates a natural scientific temperament in the larger population, and that is always beneficial for the long-term growth trajectory that any country is going to pursue. Okay, so that is how the state can be of immense help, the country can be of immense help in terms of space tech and space exploration. Now coming to a few topics very briefly, here also space tech we will talk about. So as Pragyaan digs deep into the moon, scientists at VSSC lab turn their gaze to the solar wind. So what it talks about is the fact that here by VSSC we mean the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center that caters to this various aspect of the space launches. Now the Pragyaan rover, as it is exploring the moon, and we will also see that it has sent a detailed analysis of the temperature experienced on the lunar soil. So it is carrying out its mission, but already the focus of attention in terms of VSSC has shifted to the Aditya L1 mission. Now that Aditya L1 mission here is slated to be launched in the first week of September. It is going to be launched in order to understand the properties of the solar wind. What do we mean by solar wind? You have the charged particles which are continuously emitted by the sun, and those charged particles, many of the times they end up interacting with our atmospheric setup, producing not only the northern and the southern lights, but also many of the times proving a hindrance and disturbing the communication systems, the electrical lines of supply on the planet Earth as well. So this Aditya L1 mission is to observe the outer atmosphere of the sun, to understand the properties of the solar winds, also to understand that how these solar winds, they end up changing their angle of movement as they start approaching the planet. Here it will have a particular instrument on board. This L1 mission is going to consist of 6 to 7 different payloads. One of the payload is what is being referred to as the Papa payload. And what is it? That is basically plasma analyzer package for Aditya. So this will analyze the plasma region around the sun. Now this L1 mission, it has been named because this mission is being having a destination of the Lagrange point. So the Lagrange point, which exists in the orbit between the sun and the planet Earth, so this Lagrange point is that particular point where you have a perfect balance of sorts between the gravitational attractions and repulsions exerted by the various different celestial objects. So let's suppose we consider L1 here. So if your space instrument is placed here, there it can manage to stay in that region for a longer duration of time without much consumption of fuel. So that is the Lagrange point. So between the Earth, and when it comes to the consideration between Earth and the Sun, you have 5 different Lagrange points out there. You have L1, L2, L3, L4 and L5. While L3, L4 and L5, they lie on the path of the Earth's orbit around the sun. So you cannot place a spacecraft in either of these, because then you are setting the spacecraft for a collision course with the planet. So you can either set the spacecraft on L2 or L1. But in order to observe the region of chromosphere and the outer atmosphere, the heliosphere of the sun, you need to be closer to the sun. So this Aditya L1 mission, when it is being launched, first week of September, there automatically many details will emerge out of it, that what are the basic purposes, but the major objective is to understand the properties of the solar wind and understand the vagaries indicated thereby. Okay, then here, as I told you, ISRO has also released graphs of the temperature variation of the topsoil in the region of the South Pole, as indicated by the Pragyaan rover. So here, Pragyaan rover, now by this point of time, obviously if you are following the news on a daily basis, you would be aware of the various different payloads. So here you have the CHEST, right? So you have the CHEST system. So that is Chandra's Surface Thermophysical Experiment payload, which is there, which has been put on and mounted there in order to carry out its missions and measure the thermometric readings in terms of temperature. So the graph which ISRO released was basically indicating that the temperature, while it was expected that the temperature in that region must be very, very low, but rather to the surprise, during the daytime, obviously the temperature will be high because there is no atmosphere, greater exposure to the sun. So during the daytime, obviously the temperature is able to reach around 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, and even at a depth lower into the soil, the temperature lowers, right? The temperature becomes very low. So the temperature can become minus 10 degrees C at a depth of close to around minus 8 to 10 centimeter from the surface. So the surface becomes very hot. Now this also gives you an idea that because you don't have a dense atmosphere is almost lacking. So that means during the day the temperature attained would have been very, very high. During the night, all that heat would be lost very quickly and it would be very cold surface by the night. So this is indicated by the CHEST payload, and this tells you that even in the lunar South Pole during the day, the temperature can be 50 to 60 degrees Celsius. Okay, that bodes well in order to support the human flight and human base being established in the region. Then, followed by another good news, that is Neeraj Chopra again won the gold medal for India at the World Championships, which was held in Budapest, Hungary. Now, here obviously you don't need to learn that what is the exact distance that he managed to throw the javelin into, but at these World Championships, India has tasted various forms of success. Even in the 4x400 relay, we've managed to finish 5th, which is a good considering the World Championships and the prestige for it in athletics. When it comes to athletics, Neeraj Chopra becomes the first Indian to grab a gold medal at the World Championships for athletics meet. Okay, now then coming to the last article. Now here it is about somatic mutation, a genomic revolution hiding inside our cells. So rather than going through the entire or the prolonged aspect of this article, where a lot of technical terminologies are used, here you have to understand what do we mean by somatic mutation. So basically it is a kind of an error that occurs in the DNA after birth during the developmental stage. Okay, so that is the error which has occurred in the DNA. So that causes many different issues, illnesses. Many of the times these somatic mutations in the adult human can end up causing cancer as well. So understanding how these mutations happen, understanding why these mutations happen. Now, these mutations, when they happen for various different cells, they are not uniform. They are different. Because in our body, we don't have the same type of cells which are prevalent. In our body, we have a variety of different types of cells. So all these different cells will have their own different form of mutation which is happening, own different form of where you have the older cells dying, newer cells coming into existence. That will keep on happening, that will keep on continuing. So here, in order to understand that, the US National Institute of Health has launched a program that is what is somatic mosaicism across human tissues, in order to understand a various different host of cells and their different types of mutation that occurs, different types of variations that occurs in the cell. That will help us understand the root of cancer, why cancer is caused, and if everything goes well, it will also help us create a cure for cancer. Okay, so these two points can be kept in mind, relevant for your prelims. Now, taking a look at the questions which can be derived from here. So, what is the difference between migrants and refugees? Discuss the Geneva Convention on Refugees and prescribe a way forward to resolve the issue of migrants as well. So, migrants or refugees, any of them. So, here in the answer, first of all, you have to distinguish between the migrants and the refugees. What is the difference here? Here, rather than this, we can have the refugees themselves. Okay. So, here, discuss the Geneva Convention. So, you have to talk about the rules framed as per the Geneva Convention. What is designated as a refugee, or who is designated as a refugee as per the Geneva Convention? What is the principle involved there, where the person should not be sent back, the proper human rights to be maintained, everything that you have to write. And then India is not a signatory, because you have a scope to be written in 250 words. Very briefly you can write India is not a signatory because of our natural way of allowing people to come in, which has been prevalent ever since after independence. You can also talk about that how during the 50s naturally we had many people coming in from across the border, and then during the 70s, the Bangladesh war also created an influx of refugees. So naturally, India has had an ecosystem of welcoming and housing and providing shelter to the refugees. That is why we never felt the need to have a sign on a separate convention. You also have to mention the 1967 convention, or the 1967 protocol to the convention, which was an addendum which removed all the geographical and the time-based barriers out there. And then eventually you can talk about the security aspects, why India is in a way having a significant amount of reservation of providing enlarged policy for the refugees, because the security concern are significantly predominant. So all those you have to talk about, and Way forward, we have discussed, you can list them out. How does our handling of the Himalayan ecosystem hamper the ecological balance in the Himalayan landscape? Also indicate the impact created on the human lives in the region. So understand, ecological balance in the Himalayan landscape is being talked about, and then impact on human lives. Both of them are different. Okay, so our handling of the Himalayan ecosystem, you have to talk about the anthropogenic handling of the Himalayan ecosystem in general. So here you have to first of all initiate your answer. In the introduction itself, you have to write that Himalayan ecosystem is an ecologically fragile zone where the conservation is important to conserve the critical biodiversity to be found only in that area, nowhere else. And here you can also mention the initiative by GEF, that is the Global Environment Facility, that has also brought about an initiative of Secure Himalayas, where conservation of the Himalayan habitat is talked about. So that Himalayan habitat is getting destroyed. And that is where infrastructure construction, that is leading to deposition of black carbon across the glacial ice masses, increased level of melting, receding of glaciers, the water flow in the rivers is becoming much more temporary, much more transient, due to which the aquatic species, they suffer. And also after that, after you have talked about all of this, you have to talked about the slope characteristic, you have talked about the river morphology. After that, you can talk about the impact on human lives as well. Okay, so with that, at the end of the answer, try to provide a way forward if you have the scope to write. So with that, we come to the end of the discussion. I hope the discussion was helpful, meaningful to all of you. I would suggest, advise all of you to take up the set of questions which you will find in the portion of the Telegram channel, so as to assess your level of understanding. We meet again tomorrow. Till that point of time, take care of yourself. And if you have liked the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. See you again tomorrow. Take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.